Good morning and welcome to our presentation on understanding cost share. Sorry about that little personal glitch there at the beginning. We are going to be talking about understanding cost share. I'm Joy Mills. I am one of the accountants here in grants and contracts. This is our team. If you're not familiar with all of us, be sure everybody on this presentation knows who they work with. If you have any questions, just reach out and we can direct you where you need to go. Today's agenda, we're going to talk about some cost share basics and terminology, implications of recovery, allowability, some considerations at the pre-award side, some post-award considerations, and then if there are any questions, we can answer those at the end. And this is being recorded so that people can watch it later if they need to. So cost share basics and terminology. Cost share in general is the portion of total project costs related to sponsored programs that is not provided by the sponsor. So it would be the piece that WMU is paying for in this case. It is normally in the form of a direct cost that would otherwise be charged or utilized to support the grant or contract. And it may take the form of F&A costs as well. There's some different kinds of cost share that you'll hear us talk about. There's mandatory cost share, in which the sponsor stipulates that cost share or matching funds are required as a condition of receiving the award. In that case, a percentage or amount is specifically pledged in the proposal's budget or award, and it is usually expressed in terms of a percentage of the total project cost or a percentage of the sponsor's share of the total project cost, although occasionally it can be expressed as a fixed dollar amount. But the other side of that is voluntary committed cost share, in which the sponsor does not stipulate that cost share or matching funds are required, but the PI includes cost share in the proposal budget. It is specifically pledged in the proposal budget and justification or the award. If the proposal is accepted by the sponsor and the PI has included voluntary cost share in the proposal, then it is now considered mandatory by the sponsor and must be documented. For this reason, it is required to have ORI's approval prior to submitting any proposal with voluntary cost share. There's also voluntary uncommitted cost share. This is cost share that is not committed or budgeted in a sponsored agreement. It does not need to be tracked. I'll go back and say, if you have voluntary committed cost share that is picked up, you have to track it, just like you would mandatory cost share. Uncommitted cost share does not need to be tracked for cost accounting purposes or reported to the sponsor. This most commonly would result from a cost overrun on a project or from researchers' effort, which is over and above that committed and budgeted for in a sponsored agreement. So say, for an example, someone on your award is working during the summer on the award, but they're not getting paid for it. That is uncommitted cost share. In-kind cost share would be the provision of goods or services whose value can be established by reliance on what those goods or services are worth in the open marketplace. Normally, in-kind is provided by sources outside of the university, thus it is not reflected in the university's financial system. Now I'll talk about some recovery implications. Research costs. Once funds are committed to a sponsored project, the funds can no longer be used for anything but the project. For projects where cost share is not required and funds were committed in the proposal, that voluntary cost share, the university is unable to use these funds for other purposes, such as renovating lab space or purchasing equipment. There are recovery implications for our F&A rate calculation for the university. Committed cost share is part of the organized research base for the F&A rate calculation. Therefore, the more cost share that is committed, the higher the research base. And a higher organized research base will lead to a lower approved F&A rate and consequently a lower F&A reimbursement to the university. There are documentation implications. Grants and contracts must maintain the documentation in the grant file for mandatory and voluntary committed cost share. But it is the PI that is responsible for ensuring that the cost share is documented and reported as committed in the award document. The academic department is closely involved with the documentation process. Therefore, it is necessary to consider when you're including cost share in your proposals, whether the department has the administrative staff to keep track of the cost share committed. So our office will ask for that cost share, generally speaking, and then we keep a record of it. But the academic departments are the ones that are responsible for making sure that it's happening and tracking it and providing that information when requested from grants and contracts. So there's different kinds of allowable cost share. The allowability of specific costs as cost share is usually determined by the sponsor's specific award terms and conditions. Cost shared expenses must meet the same standards that apply to costs that are directly charged to a project. So things that we talked about a month or so ago in the allowability training are the same standards that we use for cost share. Costs must be allowable and allocable under the principles included in uniform guidance. They must be verifiable from university records. They must be necessary and reasonable for proper and efficient accomplishment of the project objectives. And they must be identified in the approved award budget. And this presentation will be online later. You can go to that website to see more information on what's allowable. There are certain things that are unallowable as cost share. You cannot use expenses from one federal grant as cost share on a different federal grant. Federal appropriations or contracts and grants funded by federal agencies, either directly or indirectly as flow-through funding, are not allowable as cost sharing on another federal project. You also cannot use costs that are included as part of the FNA cost rate, such as building and equipment depreciation, utilities, department administration, etc. That is not cost share. That is, again, something that we pay for with the FNA rate. Cost sharing can only be committed and reported as cost sharing once. If cost sharing relates to 2 or more projects, it needs to be prorated between those 2 projects. And it has to be incurred within the project period of the grant. Costs that have already been incurred and were documented in the university accounting system prior to the project award date on the official award document are generally ineligible for cost sharing, unless allowed as pre-award costs with a specific agency approval. Costs that are incurred after the project termination date are also not eligible for cost sharing. There's the lack of technical relationship. If costs that are not specifically related to the performance of the project cannot be cost shared. Same as on other grants, you cannot do things that are not allowable, like alcohol, entertainment, advertising, memberships. Costs associated with a PI sabbatical leave are generally not allowable unless specifically approved by the sponsoring agency. And salary dollars in excess of the mandatory salary caps for NIH, NSF, etc., are not allowable as cost sharing, as this is already documented by the university and included in the MTDC base as if it were cost sharing. So some pre-award considerations when to include cost share in your proposal. We say only when it is mandatory. Many sponsors have indicated in their grant policies that reviewers are unable to see the level of cost share that has been put into the proposed budget. Including cost share in a proposal when it is not required limits resources available within the university and has a documentation burden associated with that to the department. When you are going to include mandatory or voluntary committed cost share in any proposal, the conditions stated previously in the section on allowable cost share must be met. So your research officer and the department chair and unit director will work with the PI to ensure that the requirements of the uniform guidance can be met and that cost sharing is accurately proposed and explained. Required or voluntary committed cost share must be indicated by completing the appropriate sections in Cayuse. Here's just an example of what we see on a budget when we're looking at cost share. So you can see here, The PI who has a fiscal year appointment is going to be committing all of their time as direct cost. Whereas we have two co-PIs that are putting in a month or 2 months during the academic year, and then some time in the summer will be as cost share. On the post-award side, cost share accounts are managed in much the same manner as project accounts. We do set up a Fund 30 for certain types of cost share, and that can be managed and tracked in GLOW, but not all cost share will require a Fund 30. The documentation for cost sharing, like I said earlier, is the responsibility of the PI and department and must conform to the requirements of federal uniform guidance. And here's some expenditures that are commonly used as cost share. Salaries and benefits tends to be the big one. Planned efforts and time and effort forms can be submitted for faculty and staff contributing cost share on a grant. This does not require the use of a Fund 30 when you're using a planned effort form. We don't necessarily need the Fund 30. It will automatically create, if we're doing the planned effort form, a record for certification in the eCert system, and that is how we're tracking it. If you have hourly staff and students that are all basically going to be cost share, you can appoint them directly to your Fund 30 that we can set up if their time is to be used as cost share. This will also create a record for certification in the eCert system. So cost share becomes part of eCert. Equipment, in general, the total cost of equipment may be offered as cost sharing only when the purchase of equipment is necessary for and dedicated to the successful completion of the project and is purchased during the project period. Cost of tuition can be allowed as cost sharing, provided that it would have been legitimately requested to be reimbursed as a direct cost. Tuition is another thing that can be posted to a Fund 30. So I have several grants where we have graduate students that are appointed to the Fund 30 to be used as cost share, and then their tuition shows up there as well. Other direct costs, such as supplies, travel, etc., can be directly charged to a Fund 30. If they are not, then we will require documentation to show where they were charged and that they are to be used as cost share on the Fund 30. Cost sharing of other direct costs can be problematic as they could be included in the indirect cost calculation, and double counting would result in cost disallowances. Other expenditures that are commonly used, there's the overhead indirect costs. They're not always an allowable cost share expense. You need to look at your specific sponsor guidelines to see if that is going to happen. That usually happens on the pre-award side. It will be included on your budget if that is allowable. When direct costs are cost shared, the indirect costs associated with the direct costs are automatically cost shared. Waived cost share. So cost share in the form of waived or reduced overhead is the difference between the full federally approved MTDC rate and what was actually awarded or funded by the sponsor. Waived F&A must be documented in the proposed budget as such. If a sponsor has a limitation on F&A, then the portion over the sponsor limit and the university's negotiated rate cannot be used. And there are expenditures that are not allowed for mandatory cost share, such as space. University space is not cost sharing. Space charges are a significant component of the indirect costs. Administrative salaries, services, supplies, and any other costs that would be classified as F&A costs rather than direct costs. And you can see more about unallowable costs as they're defined in the Uniform Guidance Title, or CFR, Code of Federal Regulations, Title II, Grants and Agreements, Part 200, Uniform Guidance. And it is also on our website. Salary dollars and associated benefits in excess of regulatory salary caps are not allowed for mandatory cost share. So the reduction in cost share. The actual effort and other costs required to accomplish the goals of a sponsored project might differ from what was proposed and awarded. The total costs could decrease due to changes in programmatic needs. A sponsor may need to be consulted to determine if the reduction can be applied to either university's committed cost sharing or to both sponsor and university resource contributions on a pro rata basis. Otherwise, the sponsor share is reduced by the university's entire cost sharing, and the university's entire cost sharing commitment must be met. Grants and Contracts has the responsibility to provide and certify information to sponsoring agencies which demonstrates that the university has fulfilled its cost sharing requirements under a specific award. And this can take many different forms depending on who your sponsor is. It is expected that PIs and departments will respond promptly to the Grants and Contracts Office request to gather information that may be needed. You have a multi-year project. It is recommended that departments work with the Grants and Contracts Office to verify cost sharing information on an annual basis, even if this information is only required at the end of the project. It's important to make sure that we are on track. And here's the thing about our upcoming trainings. Went through that and questions. So we went through that kind of quick. Wondering what kind of questions there might be. Maybe we're all good. All right, well, if there aren't any questions, I thank you for joining us today. Like I said, this will be out on the website in a few days, and you can always reach out to any of us if you have specific questions about cost share on your project, and we are happy to help. Any questions? All right, thank you.